For today's good question, Michael asks, if former President Donald Trump is convicted, will his Secret Service protection detail be permanently revoked? Michael, the simple answer is no. He would most likely keep it. That's because U.S. Code has a list of people the Secret Service is authorized to protect. That includes, quote, former presidents and their spouses for their lifetimes, except that protection of a spouse shall terminate in the event of a remarriage. Now, if President Trump had been convicted by the Senate after one of the 2 times he was impeached and then removed from office, he could have lost his post-presidential benefits. Both of those votes in the Senate, though, failed to reach the 2/3 majority required by the Constitution. So, unless Congress changes the law, the former president would still be entitled to that protection for the rest of his life. If you have a good question, you can email goodquestion@wkyt.com, and I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.